Hey guys, we are finally beginning our coverage of Survivor 47 with a preseason power ranking. So in this video, we'll be talking about each of the 18 players on this season and ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based off my first impressions of them, reading their bios and their preseason interviews. And I feel like this is a pretty solid cast for the most part, to where coming out with a winner pick was kind of difficult, but we'll get to that soon enough. But we have 18 people to talk about, and so wasting more time, let's go right into the video. So starting off at number 18, the person I believe is the least likely to win coming into the season is probably the biggest name on the cast, but we do have Jon Loveit, who is probably one of the biggest names on the cast and someone who's definitely gotten a decent amount of content in the promos, where he's obviously the host of Pod Save America, which is a somewhat large podcast. And I feel like Jon's a pretty high variance player, where he kind of reminds me a bit of David Wright or Mike White coming to their seasons, where even though there are these somewhat big names and these creative personalities, and obviously while they did well, they also kind of struggled early on. And I feel like Jon will have a very similar struggle here, though obviously at the same time, I'm not entirely sure if he can escape that, where it does seem like this tribe that he's on is not really one that's suited well for him, where I could easily see him being on the outs. And if they end up going to one of the first two tribals, I feel like he'll probably be an easy target to take out. But the thing is, while he could potentially get his feet like David or Mike, even if he gets his best case scenario, I still feel like he's pretty unlikely to win, where either he's going to be seen as this schemy, untrustworthy guy, or someone that is able to get towards the end of the game in a spot to where there's pretty big threat and eventually taken out there. So I'm not really feeling that great about Jon coming into it. And while there's definitely that upside that we saw with David Wright or Mike White, I feel like he still has to overcome a lot of adversity to even get to that point. And even if he does, I still feel like he's someone who may struggle to actually get towards the end of the game in a winning position, which is why he's here at number 18. Now moving on to number 17, and we have another person who I'm not feeling that great about, though they could surprise me by the end of it, but we do have Genevie. And Genevie is kind of an interesting personality here, which is something she thinks would put a big target on her back, considering that on 45, 3 out of the final 5 in Katurah, Jake, and Julie all ended up being lawyers, and through that lawyers would be this big target coming into the next season. So her response is to lie about her profession, even though she claims herself that she's a pretty bad liar. So I feel like right off the bat, she's not really setting herself up well to do well here. And I feel like this whole notion of lying about your profession is something that at best doesn't really gain you that much, and at worst could just blow up in your face, where people will either pick up that you're lying about your profession, or causes you to really hold back and not really reveal things about yourself, which in turn makes it harder for people to bond with you and to really care about you in the game. So I feel like Genevie is not set up to do particularly well on that front. But even outside of that, I feel like she's also someone that could be seen as this loose cannon, someone that, again, could kind of be on the outs early on, where looking at her starting tribe, I don't really see many natural allies for Genevie outside the other women there, though even then, I could see them not really trusting her that much. So I feel like Genevie is someone who I'm not getting the best sense of, both in terms of their interview answers as well as their starting tribe. But again, they could surprise me. They could end up being a better player. They could potentially be a better liar than they're letting on. But I feel like compared to the other people we'll be talking about, I feel like I got a better sense of how they're going to do in the game. And I have more confidence in those other people based off what I've seen from them so far, which is a big reason why she's here at number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we have another player that I'm not feeling the best about, though a part of me does hope that they end up doing well by the end of it. Though number 16, we do have Caroline. Now, Caroline is kind of similar to Jon Loveit in that she's pretty high variance, where it does seem like she's someone who could definitely rub some people the wrong way. She kind of reminds me a lot of Emily from 45. She even compares herself to Emily from 45 and Tori from 42, which, again, I could very much see how she relates to them, but they obviously did not have the best runs on their season. Where she herself has talked about how she has a tendency to be pretty blunt, and obviously that could cause her to be on the outs early on. Though even if she's able to get past that, I feel like a lot of people will end up comparing her to Emily and realize that she is this pretty big threat, and through that she could be a target there anyway. So again, I feel like she is kind of in that Emily spot where she's pretty high variance, and even if she gets her best case scenario, I feel like she will eventually be seen as a pretty big threat here. I think another thing to mention is that she does have ADHD, which she talks pretty heavily about in her interview. And obviously that makes her pretty endearing in my eyes, though at the same time, we literally just saw Jess from last season, someone who also had ADHD and really struggled to deal with the elements and really struggled to connect with a lot of her cast. And I think that's another thing that could cause Caroline to struggle early on, where while she may not struggle with the elements per se, I could also see a world where she kind of comes off as, again, pretty awkward, someone who's pretty overly honest, and someone who just kind of fails to click early on, though if she's able to get some runway, she could connect with people there. So again, I feel like Caroline's a pretty high variance player, and that's a big reason why she's here at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we have someone who I was initially higher on, though after seeing their interview and getting to know them a bit better, I'm not feeling that great about them. But number 15, we do have Kassan, and Kassan is someone who I was initially impressed by, where he does seem to be pretty smart. He's someone who seems to be pretty sociable, and someone who definitely has this idea of how he wants to play the game, where he talks about how as an ER doctor, he's someone who's able to work with different patients, someone who has good bedside manner. And obviously through that, you'd think that he would be able to do pretty well because of that. Though at the same time, I mean, ER doctors in particular have not done the best on Survivor. I mean, I think the prime example here is Pete from Co Wrong, who was a pre-merge boot there. Though obviously Kassan is a bit more sociable than Pete, so take that for what you will. Though I think after listening to his interview a bit more and really understanding his tribe a bit more, I do worry a bit for Kassan, where he doesn't seem like he is suited well for his particular tribe. I could see him kind of being on the outs early on, and if they do attend those first couple tribals, I could see him being a pretty blatant physical weakness and someone who could be sniped out of the game because of that. Now, at the same time, if he's able to overcome that, I do think he's pretty likable enough to where he could end up being part of the majority alliance. Though at the same time, he also doesn't come off as that big of a gamer in my eyes, to where I'm not really sure how much he's going to be leading the charge on a lot of things. So I think at the end of the day, I feel like Kassan is someone who's also kind of high variance. He's someone who I could very easily see being an early boot if his tribe struggles a lot in challenges early on. And I think that's a big reason why he's here, number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we have someone who I was also kind of higher on initially, though after listening to the interviews, I have gone down on them as well, but we do have Gabe. And Gabe was someone who I was actually kind of high on initially, where he seems to have a decent occupation as a radio show host, which a decent amount of cast has these broadcasting experiences, obviously Jon Loveit being one of them, and we'll be getting to some others soon enough. He also talks about how he worked as a bar back and that he's pretty opportunistic, and he does seem like he's here to play a pretty big game, and he does talk about being a good listener and being able to read people. And I feel like there's a lot good on paper. However, after listening to other people's interviews, a lot of people were kind of turned off by Gabe in their interviews, where it seems like he's been really stonewalling a lot of people and not really smiling at them. And while some of that could simply be him just trying to follow the rules and not actively talking with anyone, I think the fact that a lot of people aren't really getting the best first impression out of Gabe could lead to him having some trouble initially, though obviously we'll see if he's able to reverse that by the end of it. But I feel like that alone is a big reason why I do have him as low as he is, even though I feel like he's not necessarily doomed from the start. And I feel like if he's able to get around those first impressions, he could end up being in a good spot on his initial tribe. Though obviously he's also someone who I could see being a big threat, even if he does end up being this pretty big player, where he has talked pretty actively about being this pretty active player. So I feel like there's enough downside to him long term, mixing in with the negative reception he's gotten from the other players in their interviews, that leaves him behind at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have a player who I feel okay about for the most part. I don't think this is necessarily a bad player, though I feel like they have one pretty big red flag in my eyes. By number 13, we do have Anuka. And Anuka seems pretty well poised with her starting tribe here, where she is starting on the red tribe. And through that, I think she has some pretty natural allies here with the likes of Asia and Rachel, and through that possibly Andy. I feel like Anuka is someone who I can very well see being part of the initial majority alliance, and she seems to have a all right head for the game, where she seems to know what she's talking about. Though I think the major issue that I have with her is she does talk a lot about being a natural leader and that she wants to tone that back and not really be too domineering there, which I think could lead to some issues if she's unable to do so, or if she is able to get worn down by the elements. I could very well see a world where she ends up getting into confrontations with people over things around camp, and that could lead her having a target on her back if they end up struggling early on. So I feel like that flag was enough to knock her down a good amount in my eyes. I could see a world where she's a relatively early boot because of that. Though again, if she's able to ride with the majority alliance, I could also see a world where she's able to skate her way through a decent amount of games. So I'm not necessarily saying that Anuka's doomed from the start, though I could also see a world where she's kind of high variance, which is why she's here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have someone who's kind of the opposite of Anuka, where I feel like this person should have a decent amount of longevity without too much issue. However, I feel like there's very little upside beyond that longevity. But number 12, we do have Kyle, and Kyle ended up being pretty different from what I expected, where I thought coming in that he would be like this surfer bro, or someone who was just kind of like laid back for the most part, but someone who would be pretty fine just vibing for the most part. Though when reading his interview, he really comes off as someone that is very family oriented and talks so much about how he wants to do this for his children and he wants to play an honest game and a lot of stuff that you don't really see that much in modern Survivor, especially now in the new era. But unless he's like Banu and completely detached from the strategic elements of the game, I feel like Kyle should have a pretty easy ride to the merge, where I feel like he's a pretty chill guy, someone who should be able to get along with most of his cast, and someone who is physical enough in challenges to where there isn't really much of a reason to get rid of him early on. And I think that's probably the biggest upside to Kyle here, is that I feel like he's should be good enough socially to where he'll be able to get through a lot of the game all right. But I think at the same time, I just don't see Kyle being at the forefront of the strategy of the season, where I don't think he's going to bleed many votes. I don't think he's going to be very cutthroat. I don't think he's really going to have much of a killer instinct. And I could very well see him being like Ben from last season, where yes, he's surviving the votes and someone who people seem to like a lot and people want to take him deeper into the game, but it's going to lead to him not really having much respect by the end of the game, as they're not really going to favor the way that he's playing the game strategically. So I think that's a massive knock against Kyle in my eyes, where the only way I see him garnering the respect of the jury is his story and how he wants to help his family, which again could be a factor depending on who he's sitting against. But I feel like if we are just looking at how he's probably going to approach the game, I just don't see him garnering the respect of the jury simply due to how he's maneuvering through the game. So I think that's a big enough knock to leave him here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have someone who I'm not entirely sure what to do with, as I feel like this person has some serious upside, but also some concerns, if I'm being perfectly honest. But number 11, we do have Rachel, and Rachel is someone who's kind of in the similar mold to Anuka, where they're actually both part of the same tribe, and obviously with that, you would think that they would be able to work together, considering they have similar backgrounds, considering that they each talked about feeling good about each other in the preseason interviews, and I feel like a lot of that's pretty good. Though at the same time, I do think she is also someone who I could potentially see being an early boot, which is not particularly great. She is also someone who talks about how she can be a bit controlling and that she wants to know what's happening at all times, which I don't think is necessarily the correct mindset to have coming into it. So again, I think she has somewhat of a similar issue to Anuka in that she could want to be out in front initially and someone who may struggle to hold it back. Though I also think Rachel's a bigger fan of Survivor compared to Anuka, where when she was asked what winner she identifies with, she ended up going with Dino from Survivor SA, which I think shows that she has watched International Survivor and is a pretty big fan because of that. So I think that alone is a big reason why I have her above Anuka on the ranking, and I feel like she has more of an instinct to play the game compared to Kyle, which Kyle puts her above those two, though I think with those concerns about her potentially being an early boot, I do have to leave her behind at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we probably have the person I was the most conflicted on in terms of where to put them on here, as I feel like on paper this is someone who I probably would have a little bit lower, but again, after reading the interviews, I feel like this person definitely has some pros going for them. But number 10, we do have Sue, who is the oldest person on the cast at 59 years old. And Sue is someone who is definitely a pretty big character, where she talks about wanting to be a badass and how she went to flight school and that she wants to be this big adrenaline junkie and someone who is essentially the female Tony, which I was not expecting just looking at her coming into it. And I think with that comes some serious risk, where she could end up playing too hard too fast and could come off as pretty sloppy. She also talks about being pretty emotional, with that being one of her biggest weaknesses, and how she is usually wrong when she doesn't use her emotions. So I feel like that could be a worry there. And obviously with her being a bit on the older side, that could lead to her, at least on paper, being an easy target because of that. Though I think the biggest pro going for her is reading the other interviews, where a lot of people actually said that they feel good about Sue in particular, which kind of surprised me. I wasn't expecting that many people to actually feel good about Sue, at least on paper, but I think that alone should build her some goodwill coming into the season and should buy her some time to escape the target that would come with being an older woman and someone who, at least on paper, would not do well in Survivor. Though at the same time, with her again being this bigger personality, who knows if she is able to maintain that goodwill or if she ends up annoying people by the end of it. So I do think Sue's largely a mixed bag. I could very easily see it going either way for her by the end of it. But I feel like the fact that people were so high on her in their preseason interviews was enough to give me the benefit of the doubt. Though obviously we'll have to see how it truly plays out. But for now, I do have her around the middle of the list at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have someone who I really liked and someone that I kind of hope does well, though I could also see it going poorly for them. But number 9, we do have Saul. And Saul was a pretty interesting personality coming into it. And I really liked his interview. I really like Saul as a person. He seems like a pretty interesting person to talk with. Though I think in terms of him as a player, I'm kind of getting mixed signals from him where on one hand, he talks about wanting to play a Gabler style game where he is pretty under the radar for the most part. He is aware about what he needs to do. He needs to manage his threat level pretty well. And he also needs to build these bonds that allows him to get through a lot of the game to potentially win in a Gabler style, which I think is all pretty good and would be pretty interesting to see him trying to recreate the Gabler blueprint from a couple seasons ago. But at the same time, I think he may also struggle with threat management, where even though it didn't come off in his interview, he talks a lot about how he tends to be the life of the party and that when he's in a room, people are just drawn to him and he likes to make people laugh. And a lot of that could end up making him like this pretty big personality on the tribe that could obviously endear him to a lot of people, but also make him come off as a pretty big threat. Where it's kind of interesting that he ends up picking Gabler as his winner, someone who was like under the radar for a lot of his season. But then for his non-winner, he ended up going with Caleb from 45, someone who was very much out in front and someone who was bursting at the seams with charisma that obviously endeared him to a lot of people, but also made him a massive target almost immediately after the merge. And while it's good that Saul recognizes that he has his tendency, and who knows if that actually translates to the island, I think it could also be a worry where, again, if I'm going to criticize Anuka and Rachel for having these tendencies of being too domineering, I think it's also fair to call out Saul for potentially just being like very much out in front. And I think that could also paint a big target on his back there. So Saul is someone who I do like a lot and someone who I think will endear himself to a lot of people. But I think he's also someone that may struggle to actually keep his threat level pretty low, which is why he's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we very much have someone who I think will be a big presence on the show, but also a big target down the stretch. But we do have Rome. And Rome was another person that has a broadcasting background with him being an esports commentator. And you can just tell based off his interview where he has a lot of energy, is very charismatic and very entertaining. And he's another person that talks a pretty big game where despite him being the most recent fan of the board, having literally only saw the show last year, he literally binged every season in just a couple of months, which is pretty crazy there. And I think he does talk pretty interestingly about the game where he talks about how he wants to talk to the jury well, how Todd had the greatest final trial performance ever. And that's pretty bad when people just brag about their big moves when they're still playing the game. So I think there's definitely some self-awareness here where it comes to the strategic game. But at the same time, there's also some mixed signals where he talks about how he wants to be like Ozzy and win 4 individual immunity challenges, if not more. He wants to play idols. He wants to play a pretty big game. And at the same time, I think even if he is able to hold it back, I think he's someone that will just pretty naturally become this pretty big target down the stretch where, again, he is a big personality. He is someone that very openly wants to play a big game. And while he could skate his way through a lot of the game just due to his likability, he is someone who I very much struggle to see how people allow him to get anywhere near the game without being targeted. So I think there's a lot there to like about Rome, but also enough worry there in terms of him actually getting towards the end that leaves him behind at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have another person who will probably do well across the season, though I'm not entirely sure what to make of their prospects by the end of it, but we do have TK. And TK is another person who pretty naturally should do well in Survivor, where he does fit this archetype of this pretty athletic guy, but someone who's also pretty chill and affable for the most part. And that should allow him to get to the merge pretty unscathed for the most part, where I can't really see a reason why you target TK unless you think he won all the challenges. Though at the same time, there are other big people in the cast already, so not too sure how much he really stands out there. but I still think he will struggle in terms of getting towards the very end, where he does seem like he's someone who will be part of the majority alliance, but will eventually be seen as a pretty big threat there. And I think on top of that, I'm not entirely sure how much he really knows about the game, where I feel like out of all the people on the cast, he's probably one of the people that I probably had the least understanding in terms of how he's actually going to play the game. Where, yes, we see him talking about gravitating towards social and physical players, but I'm not entirely sure how that's going to translate. I don't really know how cutthroat he's going to be. I'm not really sure how strategic he's going to be, where a lot of it seems to be focused on his physical and social abilities. So I do think that is enough of a question mark to where I can't really have him too much higher than here, but I still expect TK to have a decent amount of longevity on the season, which is why he's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and I'm actually a little surprised this person is as high, as I expected this person to be quite a bit lower in my estimation. And to be fair, I think there's still a decent amount of risk with this person coming into it, but I also think there's plenty of upside. But number 6, we do have Sam. And again, Sam is another person that has a broadcasting background, with him being a beat reporter for the Tennessee Titans. And I think Sam is someone that kind of gives off mixed vibes for me, where on one hand, I did kind of have lower expectations for him coming into it, where he seemed to be like this pretty big alpha guy and someone who I think would probably be on the out socially coming into it. And even now, I still have worries about his starting tribe, where I don't see many natural allies for him, and I could see him very easily being on the outs there, possibly not being part of the majority alliance unless he's being used for challenge strength. And on top of that, there's still that long-term concern about him being this big physical guy, sort of similar to the likes of Rome and TK. But I think what has kind of sold me on Sam is the way that he talks about the game, where he has been one of the more longtime fans on the board, having watched it since he was a kid. And he definitely talks about the game in an interesting way, where he talks about wanting to play like Michelle Fitzgerald and Devin Pinto, like these people that were able to rely on their social game and not really be that far out in front. And obviously, considering the archetype that Sam fills, I think that'll be pretty necessary for Sam to really manage his threat level. I think he really understands the perception of him coming into the game. And I think on top of that, he is a pretty well-rounded person, where he talks about having done theater as a kid and that he's essentially a nerd in a jock's body. And I think that was enough to where I think I have some confidence in Sam, though at the same time, we literally saw Jelinski the last season also kind of flaming out early, despite him being a big fan of Big Brother and stuff. But I think out of these people who could end up being these massive targets on the board, I think Sam is someone who definitely has a decent amount of upside here, considering the way that he talks about the game. Though at the end of the day, I feel like compared to the top 5, I feel like Sam is still someone who will struggle in terms of managing his threat level by the end of it, even if he does talk about wanting to limit that. And mixing that in with him not having the best starting tribe in the world, I did have to leave him behind at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and this is someone who I was expecting to be a bit higher if I'm being honest, though I did kind of go down on them slightly after the interview. But at number 5, I do have Sierra. And Sierra was someone who I really liked coming out of their bio, where they have a lot of interesting things going for them, with them being in their late 20s at 27. They also have worked a number of different jobs that would seem to translate well to these social strategy games, where she is a nurse, she was a pageant queen, she worked in the service industry for a while, where she has worked in all these different jobs that require you to be good socially. And I think that should translate pretty well to Survivor for Sierra here. She also talks about wanting to play like Stephanie LaGrossa, and I think there's a decent amount here to like with Sierra in terms of her socially. Physically, she's also seems to be in pretty good shape, and I think there's a lot good there. Though I did kind of go down on her after her interview, where I'm not getting the greatest sense that she's going to be that active strategically, to where I could easily see her being a tag along to whatever alliance she's a part of. And sort of similar to Kyle, she doesn't really come off as a new era player that much. She kind of feels like these players that we had gotten from the older era of the show, particularly from the 10s and the 20s. So I do worry how that will translate to her on a season like this. But I still feel like she's someone who you would think would have a lot of longevity within them. And if she's able to translate a lot of these physical and social abilities, then she should have a decent amount of upside there. But I think there's enough holding her back to where she's here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4. And these top 4 are essentially my contenders to win the season. It's just a matter of ordering them. By number 4, we have someone who I'm pretty excited to see play, though I also worry about their long-term target level. By number 4, we do have Tini. And Tini is a very interesting prospect here, being one of the bigger super fans on the board, where they are most known for playing Survivor LRG. And I think there's a lot to like here with Tini, where they seem to be pretty well rounded in all three aspects of the game, where they've been going to the gym a lot to get into good shape. They also seem pretty good socially, and obviously they understand the strategy of the game. Now, mind you, they did also talk about how they're not the best at number crunching, which could be an issue down the stretch. And I think on top of that, there's a lot of worry that they could be like Evie from 41, where yes, Tini could be able to be in a good position on their starting tribe, but then after the merge, they become a pretty big threat because of that. And I think Tini reminds me a lot of Evie in that regard, to where they are this pretty big fan, someone who I would expect would be in a pretty good spot on their starting tribe, and obviously made the merge because of that. But again, I think there's enough worry there in terms of their long-term prospects that I do have to leave them behind at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have another person who I'm feeling pretty good about at this point, and this is actually the person who I personally am the most excited to see on the season. But at number 3, I do have Asia Welch, and Asia is a very interesting prospect here, where if you're not familiar, Asia is a podcaster for RHAP and is a very well-known figure within the Survivor Superfan community. And I think even beyond that, Asia is a very strong prospect here, where obviously she knows the game. She literally talks about it online, so she obviously is going to know the strategy of the game. I think socially, I think she's also pretty articulate and someone that is able to connect with a lot of people. And I think she's someone who will connect with a lot of people, including the people that recognize her, with the likes of Tini and Andy. They have each talked about wanting to work with Asia due to them being familiar with her through RHAP. So I think that will also help her there. And I think she's also someone who is decent enough physically to where she'll be pretty strong there. So I think there's a lot to like here. I think she's also someone who I would expect to be part of the Majority Alliance on our starting tribe. So I think there's a lot good there. And I think there's a lot of upside with Asia. I think she's someone who could very easily make the merge without too much difficulty, and someone who's able to play a pretty effective game. And that is a big reason why she is one of my contenders to win the game. But the main reason that I didn't go with her as my winner pick is I still worry about her long term, where I could see her being similar to like Tiffany from 46 or Drea from 42, someone who's able to play a pretty big game, but is eventually sniped out around like the final 8 or final 7. I think there's a lot of worry for that when it comes to Asia. And with me being a bit more confident in the top 2 selections, I did have to leave Asia behind at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and it was pretty close between these top 2, as I didn't really know which way to go in terms of who I have as my winner pick. And it's pretty funny that these 2 are my top 2 considering the comparisons that I have with them compared to previous players. But at number 2, I did decide to go with Andy. And Andy is another pretty interesting prospect here, where he's another pretty notable figure in the superfan community, where he is an RHAP patron, and through that recognizes Asia Welch and talks about her in his preseason interview. And I think there's a lot to like here with Andy. He seems to be a pretty well-rounded player, pretty good physically, pretty good socially, pretty good strategically, obviously. And there's been a lot of comparisons to Austin from 45, where he literally even looks like Austin, and people have noted that in their preseason interviews. And I actually think this comparison is pretty favorable for Andy here, where even though Austin did pretty well on 45, he still lost in a spot to where the perception is that he was outplayed by D, and even before that was not seen as the mastermind of the Reba 4 Alliance. So I think Austin is someone who is pretty underestimated in the Survivor community, pretty underestimated by a lot of people on the season. And I think that could work out to Andy's favor, as I feel like Andy could improve upon what Austin did, still do pretty well, but actually have the killer instinct to make the moves that he needs to in order to actually win the game. So I think those things are really what is elevating my view of Andy here coming into the season, on top of the fact that he is this pretty standard person that I would have in pretty high regard. Now, the main reason why he is not my winner pick, though, is there were definitely some people that were kind of sus of him in their interviews. I think there's still this worry that he could be seen as a threat regardless. And on top of that, he himself even admits in his interview that he is prone to overthinking, which, while I don't think will lead to him blowing up his game per se, is still a knock against him and still something that I could see working to his disfavor. So I think those things were just enough to where I did not go with him as my winner pick, even though he's still someone who I expect to do well and someone who I personally would want to do well. But I think those things were enough to leave him here at number 2. And now, at number 1, my winner pick going into Survivor 47 is Tiana, the first native Hawaiian to play Survivor. And I think there's also a lot to like here with Tiana here, where, for one, she's a flight attendant, an occupation that historically has done pretty well in Survivor, where you have the likes of T-Bird from Survivor Africa, Todd Herzog from Survivor China, even Ricard from Survivor 41. I feel like being a flight attendant is a pretty favorable occupation for Survivor, as you obviously had to deal with people on a daily basis. You're under a lot of stress. So I think that works pretty well for Tiana here. And on top of that, I think she's a pretty well-rounded player, pretty good socially, pretty good physically as well, where she was a volleyball player in college. And while she's not the biggest super fan on the board, I think she understands the strategy well enough to where she should do pretty well there as well. And on top of that, you also have plenty of people talking about feeling good about Tiana, where I don't think anyone really feels that poorly about her coming into it. And I think she's someone that will pretty naturally gravitate towards a lot of people here. And it's kind of funny that I have Andy at number 2, someone who people are literally calling the mini Austin. I think Tiana is someone who reminds me a lot of Dee from 45, as I feel like she kind of gives off that vibe to me when listening to her. And I think she definitely has a lot of those skills to really connect with a lot of people. So I think those things are working pretty well in her favor. And while it could also be a detriment in that people will think of her as D and want to target her because of that, I think she's someone who is well-rounded enough at the game to where she shouldn't be an early target. And I think she still has the capability of playing a D-like game without having the downside of being targeted and still getting to the end in a winning spot. I think there's a lot to like about Tiana, and while it could all blow up by the end of it, and obviously I could be wrong about all these people, which is kind of par for the course when it comes to these preseason power rankings, I think Tiana is the person who I feel the most confident about coming into the season, and it's for that reason that she's my winner pick, and she's here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now next week, after we get the premiere, I'll be updating these power rankings again, and we'll see how well a lot of these takes aged, so stay tuned for that. I'm still covering Big Brother 26, so stay tuned for that as well, and I'm covering Hell's Kitchen when that starts, so look forward for that. I'm on Patreon as well as having a YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot still coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.